every single day, thousands of tourists walk past the gates of Buckingham Palace. They take their photos. They point their cameras. They whisper and laugh and nudge each other. And every single day, the royal guards stand there perfectly still, perfectly silent, perfectly unmoved. Like statues made of flesh and discipline. Most tourists go home with nothing but a photograph. But, on one cold Tuesday morning in October, one woman went home with something she would carry for the rest of her life. And every single person who was standing on that pavement that morning would never quite forget what they saw. This is not a story about a palace. This is not a story about a uniform or a tradition. This is a story about what happens when a person mistakes dignity for weakness and learns, in the most public way possible, exactly how wrong they were. The morning started the way most London mornings do in October. Grey sky, damp air, the kind of cold that gets into your coat no matter how many layers you are wearing. The tourists had been arriving since just after 9. Families with pushchairs, couples with matching backpacks, school groups following tired teachers holding little flags in the air. The usual crowd. The usual noise. The usual stream of people pressing their faces against the iron gates, hoping for a glimpse of something royal and magnificent. Her name was Patricia Holden. 43 years old, from a mid-sized city in the American Midwest, and she had been in London for 4 days already. She had done the Tower of London. She had done the Eye. She had eaten fish and chips on a bench by the Thames and taken approximately 800 photographs of red telephone boxes. By her own account, shared loudly and frequently, London had been slightly disappointing. Too cold. Too grey. Too expensive. The people were polite but not friendly, she said. The food was fine but not exciting. She had been expecting something more dramatic, more cinematic, more like the London she had seen in movies. What she found instead was a real city, full of real people, going about real lives, and that had somehow not been enough. Her travel companion was a woman named Denise, her college roommate from 20 years ago, now a kindergarten teacher from the same city. Denise was quieter, more easily delighted, the kind of traveler who stops to look at pigeons and means it. She had spent the morning trying to match Patricia's energy while privately wishing they could sit down somewhere warm and drink tea without Patricia narrating everything that was wrong with the menu. They arrived at the palace around 10:30. The crowd was already several people deep along the railings. Patricia pushed her way to a decent spot, took her photographs, zoomed in on the guards, and declared them boring. "They just stand there," she said. "What is the point?" Denise said she thought it was actually quite impressive, standing that still for that long. Patricia said she could do it for 20 minutes, easy. Denise said nothing to that. The guard standing nearest to their section of the railing was a young man. 22 years old, though he looked younger in his bearskin hat and red tunic. His name was Corporal James Whitfield, and he had been on ceremonial duty at the palace for 14 months. He was good at it. His sergeant said he was one of the best they had, not just for the stillness, which anyone could train into themselves with enough repetition, but for the composure. The ability to remain genuinely, internally calm no matter what was happening in front of him. And things happened in front of him regularly. People shouted. People made faces. People tried to make him laugh, tried to startle him, tried everything short of actually touching him to get a reaction. He had seen it all. He was not impressed by any of it. What he could not see, because his eyes were focused at the middle distance, trained there by months of practice, was that Patricia Holden was now holding a large paper cup of takeaway tea that she had bought from a cart about 50 meters away. She had been drinking it as she walked. It was still hot. Not scalding, but hot enough. And she had an idea. It started as a joke. That is what she would say later, and, in one narrow sense, she was probably telling the truth. She was not a cruel person, not in any deep or intentional way. She was bored and cold and slightly disappointed by her holiday, and there was a very still young man in a very impressive uniform standing less than 2 meters away from her, and something about the combination of those facts produced a decision that she would spend a long time regretting. She held the cup just over the iron railing and tilted it slowly, letting a thin stream of hot tea fall toward the pavement directly in front of the guard's boots. She was not pouring it on him. She was not touching him. She was nowhere near him, technically. But the tea landed close enough that a few drops splashed onto the toe of his left boot. And she was laughing while she did it. Her phone was in her other hand, filming. She said something. The people around her would remember different versions of what it was, but most of them agreed it was something along the lines of, "Let's see if he moves now." He did not move. Not a flinch. Not a blink. Not a tightening of the jaw or a flicker behind the eyes. He stood exactly as he had been standing, and the tea soaked into the toe of his boot, and he remained completely still. Patricia laughed harder. She looked at her phone. She looked at Denise. She looked at the people around her, some of whom were also laughing, because humans are like that in crowds. Someone laughs and the laughter spreads before anyone has decided whether the thing is actually funny. She tilted the cup again. That was when everything changed. Not because of the guard. He still had not moved. What changed was the crowd itself. Because not everyone was laughing. A woman standing 2 people to Patricia's left had stopped smiling. An older British man in a flat cap was staring at Patricia with an expression that was not quite anger. It was something quieter and colder than anger. A teenager with a camera lowered the camera. Denise took a step back, not dramatically, just a small, private step that put a little distance between herself and what was happening. And then, the older man in the flat cap spoke. He did not shout. He did not make a scene. He simply said, in a voice that carried without being raised, that what she was doing was not clever, and that the young man standing there had more dignity in his left boot, the wet one, than most people managed in a lifetime. The laughter died. Not immediately, but within a few seconds it was gone, replaced by a silence that was somehow heavier than the noise had been. Patricia looked at the man. She looked at her phone. She looked at the guard, who was still perfectly still focused on nothing, still giving her absolutely nothing to work with. And, for the first time since she had tilted that cup, she felt something other than amusement. She felt the weight of what she had just done. Not the legal weight. She had not broken any law, had not technically crossed any line. The other weight. The human weight. The recognition, arriving later than it should have, that she had tried to use a real person as a prop in her own entertainment, and that the real person had declined to participate, and that everyone standing around her had watched her do it. She lowered the cup. She said nothing. The older man had already looked away. James Whitfield, Corporal, Coldstream Guards, stood exactly where he had been standing. His boot was wet. He did not look down at it. He would not look down at it for another 40 minutes, until his relief arrived and he marched back inside and someone handed him a cloth. What he thought during those 40 minutes is a question only he can answer. What people standing on that pavement thought, however, was becoming very clear. Because phones were still out, and videos were already uploading, and the world was about to get a much wider view of what had just happened on that cold Tuesday morning in October. But Patricia did not know that yet. She was still standing at the railing. Denise had moved further away now, pretending to look at something in the other direction. The older man in the flat cap had walked off. The crowd had thinned slightly around Patricia in the way crowds thin around things that have become uncomfortable. She was standing in a small, invisible circle of her own making. She put her teacup in a bin. She looked at her phone. She almost put a clip on her social media. Then, she didn't. Some instinct that had arrived too late told her that was not a good idea. She was right. But it did not matter, because 11 other people had already posted their own footage. By the time Patricia and Denise sat down for lunch at a cafe 20 minutes away, the clip was already spreading. A woman pouring hot tea near a royal guard who did not flinch. A flat-cap man's quiet, devastating comment. The moment when the laughter stopped. By evening, it had been viewed by 2 million people. By the following morning, 4.5 million. By the time Patricia Holden landed back in the United States 4 days later, it was one of the most discussed videos on the internet, and her face was in the thumbnail on news websites from London to Tokyo. She had wanted something more dramatic from London. Something more cinematic. Something like the movies. She had got it. Just not in the way she had imagined. What almost nobody watching the video knew, what Patricia herself had no way of knowing as she stood at that railing, was that James Whitfield had a history that made his stillness mean something entirely different than people assumed. Most viewers saw discipline. Most viewers saw training. Most viewers saw a young soldier doing his job. And all of that was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was considerably more complicated, and considerably more human, and when it came out in the days that followed, it changed the way people watched the video. It changed the way they thought about the man in the red tunic. And it changed, quietly, privately, in ways she would not talk about for months, the way Patricia Holden thought about herself. The story was only beginning. By the time the video hit 3 million views, people had started doing something that the internet always does when a stranger becomes famous against their will. They started looking. Not at Patricia, not yet. At the guard. At the young man in the red tunic who had stood there like a wall while hot tea splashed against his boot and the crowd laughed and the woman with the phone kept filming. There was something in his face, or rather the deliberate absence of expression in his face, that made people want to understand what was behind it. Who was he? What was he thinking? What does a person have to be made of to stand that still in that moment? The British press found him first, the way the British press always finds people, through sources inside the institution, through a sergeant who mentioned something to a reporter over a pint, through the kind of soft information that leaks before anyone has officially decided to release anything. His name appeared in a military blog post first, then in a short item in a tabloid, then in a longer piece in a broadsheet that someone had clearly put real effort into. Corporal James Whitfield. 22 years old. Born in a small town in Shropshire. His father had been a soldier. His grandfather had been a soldier. The military was not a decision he had agonized over, it was simply the direction his life had always been pointing, the same way a river does not decide to flow downhill. He had enlisted at 18, trained hard, been posted to the Coldstream Guards at 19, and arrived at ceremonial duty at 21. His record was clean. His commanding officers described him in terms that sound like understatement but aren't: reliable, steady, good under pressure. A soldier who did not need to be told things twice. None of that was what caught people's attention. What caught people's attention was a detail buried in the third paragraph of the broadsheet piece. 7 months before that Tuesday morning in October, James Whitfield had been involved in a training accident. Not a small one. A vehicle rollover during a night exercise, 2 other soldiers injured, Whitfield himself pulled from the wreckage with a serious shoulder injury and a concussion that had kept him off active duty for 11 weeks. The recovery had been hard. Not just physically, the piece was careful about this, citing a source close to his family, but mentally. He had struggled in a way that soldiers are not always given permission to admit they are struggling. He had, at one point, not been sure he was going to return to service. He had returned. 11 weeks of recovery, 3 months of rehabilitation, a medical clearance that his doctors had described as thorough but ultimately positive. He had gone back to his unit, asked to return to ceremonial duty specifically, not despite how visible it was, but because of it. His commanding officer had asked him, during a quiet moment, why ceremonial? Why not something with less public exposure, given everything? And James Whitfield had apparently said something simple. He had said that standing still in public, in front of people, without flinching, that was the thing he needed to prove he could still do. Not for the tourists. For himself. When the internet found this story, the conversation changed completely. The comments that had been roughly divided between people laughing at Patricia, people defending Patricia, and people philosophizing about tourism and cultural respect, those comments restructured themselves into something much more unified. Not hatred toward Patricia, not exactly, but a kind of collective emotional recalibration. People were not just watching a woman try to make a guard move anymore. They were watching a woman try to break a person who had already been broken once, and who had put himself back together specifically so he could stand in that spot, on that morning, and not be broken again. Patricia Holden, sitting in her house in the American Midwest, did not know any of this. She had spent the first day after the video went viral in a state of defensive disbelief. The comments on her own social media were not kind. Some of them were genuinely cruel, which is the internet's habit regardless of the scale of the original offense. She had made her accounts private. She had called Denise and asked what she thought was happening, and Denise, who had been following the story more closely, had been quiet for a moment before telling her that it was getting complicated and that maybe Patricia should just not look at it for a few days. Patricia asked why. Denise said she would send her a link. Then, she thought about it and said actually no, maybe give it a day first. Patricia gave it a day. Then, she looked. She sat in her kitchen with a cup of coffee that went cold while she read. She read the broadsheet piece. She read the military blog post. She read the comments, not all of them, nobody reads all of them, but enough to understand the temperature of the thing. She watched the video again, which she had not done since the first morning, and this time she watched it differently. She watched herself. The tilt of the cup. The laugh. The look at her phone. And she watched James Whitfield. Looked at his face for the first time, really looked at it, not as a prop in a photograph but as a person's face. 22 years old. 7 months out of a vehicle rollover that had nearly ended his career. Standing there because he needed to prove to himself that he still could. She closed the laptop. She sat in her kitchen for a long time. Meanwhile, in London, James Whitfield was having his own complicated relationship with his sudden visibility. He had been asked, through proper channels, whether he would like to make a statement. He had thought about it and said no. Then, a few days passed in, he changed his mind and said yes, but only a short one, and he would not be doing interviews or photographs. His statement was released through the regiment's media office. It was 6 sentences long. The statement said that he was aware of the video and that he understood why people had found it interesting. It said that he bore no ill will toward the tourist involved, that he had experienced far worse in his time on ceremonial duty, and that the discipline required for the role was not about suppressing emotion but about choosing where to place your attention. It said that if there was anything worth taking from the situation, it was perhaps a reminder that the people in those uniforms were real people, not ornaments, not props, not a test of patience to be passed or failed for entertainment, but soldiers with histories and training and reasons for being exactly where they were. It said that he hoped everyone involved was well. It did not mention the accident. It did not mention the recovery. It said nothing that could be described as angry or bitter or pointed. It was, by any measure, a considerably more gracious statement than the situation required. When the statement came out, the conversation changed again. Because now people had both pieces. The tourist who had laughed, and the soldier who had declined to be angry about it. And the combination of those two things produced something more interesting than either alone: a genuine question about dignity, about respect, about how we treat strangers and what it costs us when we treat them badly and what it costs the other person when they choose not to make us pay. A retired general wrote a long column about it in one of the major papers. A sociologist was interviewed on the radio about tourist culture and the objectification of ceremony. A veterans' mental health charity posted a thread about the hidden pressures on soldiers returning from injury, using the story as a case study without naming anyone. A philosopher whose name nobody could spell wrote a piece about the ethics of public space and who it belongs to. The story had grown entirely beyond Patricia Holden's cup of tea, beyond James Whitfield's wet boot, beyond the cold Tuesday morning when it started. It had become a conversation the world was apparently ready to have. But the part of the story that most people were not watching yet was the quiet part. The private part. Patricia had not gone back to social media. She had not given any interviews, had not responded to the requests from the news websites, had not done any of the things that people in her situation sometimes do: the tearful apology video, the statement through a publicist, the carefully managed narrative of contrition and redemption. She had gone quiet, which some people read as guilt and others read as arrogance, and most people, as always, didn't bother to read it all because they had moved on to the next thing. What she had actually done, in the privacy of her kitchen and, then, her bedroom and, then, on a long walk around a lake near her house that she took twice a week when she needed to think, was something less dramatic and, more honest than any of those options. She had spent a week being uncomfortable with herself. Not in the way people are uncomfortable when they get caught, not strategically uncomfortable, not publicly uncomfortable, but genuinely, privately, quietly uncomfortable in the way a person is when they look at something they have done and cannot quite make it acceptable no matter which angle they view it from. She had tried. She had told herself it was just a joke. She had told herself other people were laughing too. She had told herself the guard was fine, clearly fine, hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, was obviously not bothered. She had told herself the internet was overreacting, that the scale of the response was completely disproportionate to what was a small and thoughtless act in the large and ongoing category of small and thoughtless acts that everyone commits every day. She had made some of these arguments to Denise, who had listened patiently and, then, said, not unkindly, that maybe the issue wasn't whether the guard was bothered. Maybe the issue was what it said about what she thought she was allowed to do to another person. Patricia had said that was a bit much. Denise had said maybe. They had left it at that. But the argument had stayed with Patricia. The way Denise's quiet arguments always did, which is why they had been friends for 20 years. What she thought about, on the second walk around the lake, was not the video and not the comments and not James Whitfield's statement, which she had read 3 times. What she thought about was something smaller. She thought about the moment just before she tilted the cup. The decision, if it had even been a decision, if something that fast and unthought could be called that. She had looked at a young man standing very still in an impressive uniform, and something in her mind had categorized him as a thing rather than a person. A feature of the landscape. An attraction. Something that was there to be interacted with rather than someone who was standing there with a life attached to him, with a history, with a body that had been hurt and a mind that had been tested and a specific, deliberate reason for being in that exact spot on that exact morning. She had looked right at him and somehow not seen him. And she was not sure, walking around the lake in the gray October air, that she could explain exactly how a person does that. Looks right at someone and doesn't see them. But she was quite sure it was a thing she had done, and quite sure she did not want to do it again. She went home. She opened her laptop. She started to write something that she didn't know yet whether she would send or publish or show to anyone. What she was writing was a letter. Not a public apology. Not a statement. A letter, addressed to a specific person, telling the truth about what she thought had happened and what she thought it meant. She did not know if she would send it. She did not know if it would be welcome. She did not know what she expected it to accomplish, which might have been why it was turning out to be the most honest thing she had written in years. Outside, a month had passed since the morning in front of the palace. James Whitfield had gone back to duty. The video was still out there, but people had mostly stopped talking about it. The world had moved on, the way the world does, to the next thing and the thing after that. The comments had quieted. The columns had been written. The radio interviews were archived. The sociologist had moved on to a new case study. The philosopher's piece had been shared and forgotten and was now somewhere in the middle distance of the internet, technically findable, practically gone. What remained was quieter than all of that. A woman in a Midwestern kitchen with a half-written letter on her screen. A soldier in London who had gone back to standing in the cold without anyone watching him much anymore. And something that had shifted, in both of them, that had not shifted back. The story was not over. But its loudest chapter was behind it now. What came next was smaller, slower, and, in its own way, considerably more surprising than anything that had happened so far. 6 weeks after the video, Patricia Holden finished the letter. She had started it 3 times and deleted it twice. The first version was too apologetic in a performed way. It sounded like an Instagram caption, all the right words in the right order but hollow underneath. The second version swung too far the other way and became defensive, explaining her state of mind, contextualizing the cold morning and the disappointing holiday and the crowd that had been laughing too, as if the point of the letter was to make herself look understandable rather than to say something true. She deleted that one faster than the first. The third version she sat with for 2 full days before she decided it was as honest as she was capable of being, and that waiting for it to become more honest was just a way of never sending it. She sent it through the regiment's media office. She did not expect a reply. She did not ask for one. She said that in the letter itself, that she was writing it because something needed to be acknowledged and not because she expected or deserved anything in return. She said that she had looked at him and not seen him, and that she understood now what that meant, and that she was sorry. Not for the internet's reasons or the newspaper's reasons or the comments section's reasons. For her own reason, which was simpler and harder to say. She had treated a person like a piece of furniture, and the person had turned out to have a history she could not have known and a courage she had not been able to see, and she was sorry. She sent it on a Tuesday. She did not tell Denise until the following Friday. Denise said, after a pause, that she was proud of her. Patricia said she didn't know if proud was the right word. Denise said maybe not, but she was using it anyway. For 2 weeks Patricia heard nothing. She had expected nothing, so nothing was not a disappointment. She went back to her life, her job, her routine, the weekly walk around the lake. The story had faded from public view. Her social media accounts were still private. She had not reposted, had not commented, had not done any of the things that signal a person is working the narrative in their favor. She had gone quiet and stayed quiet, which is harder than it sounds when you have watched 2 million people form an opinion of you. The reply came on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after she had sent the letter. It was short. It had come through the media office's forwarding, typed on what looked like standard paper, with no letterhead and no formal closing. James Whitfield had written it himself. That much was obvious from the plainness of it, the slight irregularity in how the sentences were arranged, the absence of official language. He said he had received her letter and read it. He said he appreciated that she had written it, and that it had not been required of her, and that he understood that. He said that he did not carry anger about the incident, and that this was true before the letter arrived and not something she had created by sending it. He said that what had struck him, reading her letter, was the part about not seeing him, not the apology itself, but the attempt to describe how the thing had happened in the first place. He said he thought that was probably a more useful thing to understand than the apology, and that he was glad she had tried to understand it. He said he hoped she was well, and that London, on a warmer day, was actually quite nice. That was it. No drama. No forgiveness speech. No cinematic reconciliation. Just a short, plain, human reply from a 22-year-old soldier in Shropshire bred letters that said, essentially, I read what you wrote and it was worth writing. Patricia sat in her kitchen and read it 4 times. She did not post it. She did not tell anyone except Denise. She put it in the drawer of her bedside table, which is where she kept the things she wanted to be able to find. She thought about that phrase for a long time. Not the apology itself, but the attempt to understand how it happened. She had not expected him to find that part interesting. She had not even been sure it belonged in the letter. It had felt, writing it, like an explanation sneaking in through the back door of an apology. But he had put his finger on exactly the sentence that had cost her the most to write and said that was the part that mattered. She thought about that for the rest of the week. Meanwhile, James Whitfield had returned to a version of normal that was not quite the same as the version that existed before October. Not because of Patricia, or the video, or any of the columns and commentary and veteran charity threads. Those had passed over him mostly without sticking. He was not, by nature, someone who spent a lot of time reading about himself. What had changed was something internal and quieter. He had stood in front of millions of people, at least in digital effigy, and the story that emerged had not been the one he chose or controlled or planned. The story had been his injury, his recovery, his need to stand there for himself rather than for them. And he had not told that story. It had been found and told without him, and it had spread in the way true things sometimes spread, and people had understood something about him that he had never intended to make public. He had thought, in the weeks after the video, about whether that felt like a violation. Like something taken. He had concluded, sitting in the mess one evening with a cup of tea, that he was aware of the irony of, that it did not feel that way. It felt more like something that had been seen. Not taken, seen. There is a difference, though it takes some time to find it. He had spent 11 weeks in recovery, not quite believing he would be allowed back to the thing that was most him. He had come back. He had stood in the cold. He had been looked at by a lot of people, in a lot of different ways, and he had remained himself throughout. That was not nothing. In fact, he had decided, on that evening in the mess, it was quite a lot. His shoulders still ached in cold weather. It would probably always ache in cold weather. He had made peace with that. The story, by December, had settled into its final form, not a viral moment anymore, not a current event, but the kind of story that gets bookmarked and reshared every few months, that ends up in lists about dignity and public respect and the hidden lives of people in uniform. The clip still exists. The comments are still there. The columns are still archived. The story still travels. What travels with it now, if you look for it, is the fuller version. The accident, the recovery, the choice to come back. The woman who wrote a letter. The soldier who wrote back. The older man in a flat cap who said one quiet sentence into a crowd and stopped the laughter cold. None of these people planned to be part of each other's stories. None of them signed up for a lesson about dignity or visibility or what it means to look at someone and actually see them. They just ended up on the same pavement on the same gray October morning, and something happened, and it turned out to matter. Patricia went back to London the following April. She told herself it was because she wanted to give the city a proper chance, which was true. She told herself she had nothing specific she needed to do there, which was also true. She booked a flat in Kensington for 5 days. She did not tell anyone except Denise, who said she was glad, and her sister, who said she was brave, and Patricia said it was not brave, it was just a holiday. On her 3rd day, she walked to Buckingham Palace. She stood at the railing, in the spring sunlight this time, the sky a pale clear blue that is very different from October gray, the tourists around her just as numerous but somehow lighter in mood, the whole scene softer and more forgiving than it had been 7 months earlier. She stood at the railing and she looked at the guards. She did not know if James Whitfield was among them. She had not tried to find out. She looked at the guards in the way she had not looked at them the first time, as people, as individuals, as human beings who had chosen to be there and who had histories attached to them that she could not see. She stood there for a long time. She took no photographs. A family next to her had 2 small children who kept pressing their faces against the iron railings and whispering to each other about the tall hats. An older couple to her other side were quietly reading the names of the regiment from a small guidebook. A teenage boy directly behind her was explaining to his friend in very loud tones that the guards were trained to never react to anything. His friend said that sounded boring. The teenage boy said it sounded impossible. Patricia, without turning around, found herself agreeing with the second assessment more than the first. She stayed for about 20 minutes. She bought a cup of tea from the same cart she had used in October, which she recognized by the small handwritten sign advertising a specific blend. She drank it standing up, holding the cup with both hands for warmth even though it was April and not really that cold. She drank the whole thing before she walked away. She put the empty cup in the bin on the corner. On the walk back to her flat, she thought about something James Whitfield had written in his reply. That London, on a warmer day, was actually quite nice. She looked up at the pale blue sky. She looked at the parks, the buildings, the people on the pavement, the red buses, all of it. She thought about how a city can be the same city in different seasons and feel entirely different depending on what you were looking for and what you were carrying with you and whether you are watching the world as a background to your own story or as a collection of other people's stories that you happen to be moving through. It was quite nice. She had to admit it. Actually quite nice. She did not take a photograph of the sky. She just looked at it. The video is still out there. If you search for it you will find it in about 3 seconds, because the internet forgets nothing. You can watch it again and you will see the same things, the cup, the tea, the laughter, the stillness, the silence that fell when the man in the flat cap spoke. You can read the comments. You can find the columns, the charitable threads, the philosopher's archived piece, the veterans' charity post. But what you cannot find online because it was never posted or published or photographed, is the part of the story that happened after the video stopped trending. The letter in a drawer in a Midwestern bedroom. The reply written on plain paper with no letterhead. The woman standing at a railing in April sunlight, holding a cup of tea with both hands, not taking a photograph, just looking. The soldier whose shoulder aches in cold weather, standing in his spot, proving to himself again the thing he has been proving since he came back. Those parts are not viral. They will never be viral. They are just true, which is a different thing entirely, and, in some ways harder to find, and worth considerably more when you do. There is a version of this story that ends with a lesson, tidy, stated, resolved. A version that tells you what to think and how to feel and what you should take away and apply to your own life. This is not that version. This is the version where a woman poured tea near a guard and the world watched and the world moved on, and two people, somewhere in the quiet after the noise, found a way to be decent to each other without an audience. Which is, when you think about it, the only way it ever really counts. The morning in October is in the past. The pavement is the same. The palace is the same. The guards stand in the cold and the tourists press against the railings and the red buses go past on the road behind them and the gray sky sits above it all, perfectly unmoved. Somewhere in that scene, right now, a young soldier is standing very still. People are watching him. Some of them are actually seeing him. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is, in its quiet way, everything.